Welcome back to Second Chance Histories, where we explore the extraordinary moments that force us to confront the true cost of our choices and discover that redemption is possible even when we think we've gone too far to turn back. Today's story takes us into the mind of 52-year-old Richard Sterling, a corporate executive who built his empire on the ruins of other people's dreams. When a massive stroke left Richard in a coma, his consciousness became trapped in what can only be described as a courtroom of his own making, forced to witness, one by one, every person whose life he had systematically destroyed in his climb to the top. But it was the final confrontation that would shatter everything Richard thought he knew about power, success, and the person he had become. This is the story of the Mirror of Regrets, where a man who had spent decades avoiding accountability was finally forced to face the human cost of his ruthless ambition, and discovered that the person he needed to confront most was the man he used to be. Richard Alexander Sterling had built Sterling Industries into a billion-dollar conglomerate through what business magazines euphemistically called aggressive acquisition strategies. But behind the corporate jargon lay a pattern of behavior that had destroyed hundreds of lives and shattered countless families. At 52, Richard was everything he had dreamed of becoming in his 20s: wealthy, powerful, feared, and respected in boardrooms across the country. He owned homes in Manhattan, the Hamptons, and Aspen. His personal wealth exceeded $800 million. Business competitors studied his methods, and Harvard Business School used his acquisitions as case studies in strategic corporate restructuring. But Richard's success had come at a devastating human cost that he had spent decades learning to ignore. His specialty was identifying struggling companies with valuable assets, acquiring them at below-market prices, and then restructuring them in ways that maximized profit while eliminating what he considered inefficiencies, a corporate term that usually translated to firing long-time employees, canceling pension obligations, and selling off assets that communities depended on. Richard Sterling doesn't acquire companies, one business journalist had written. He performs corporate autopsies on living businesses. Over 25 years, Richard had acquired 47 companies. In the process, he had terminated over 12,000 employees, canceled pension benefits for thousands of retirees, closed 23 manufacturing facilities, and destroyed the economic foundations of 8 small communities that had depended on the businesses he dismantled. Richard knew these statistics because his executive assistant prepared annual efficiency reports that quantified the human impact of his decisions. But he had trained himself to see these numbers as business metrics rather than human tragedies. Emotional thinking is the enemy of profitable decisions, Richard often told his management team. We're not in business to provide charity or job security. We're in business to maximize shareholder value. Richard had built psychological walls between himself and the consequences of his actions. He lived in exclusive communities where he never encountered the people affected by his business practices. He socialized only with other wealthy executives who validated his belief that ruthless capitalism was not just acceptable but necessary. When local news outlets covered the devastating effects of his plant closures and mass layoffs, Richard's public relations team dismissed such reporting as anti-business propaganda and economic illiteracy. But Richard's ability to avoid confronting the human cost of his success was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. On a Friday morning in October 2019, Richard was in his Manhattan office preparing for what he expected to be another routine business triumph: the final paperwork for acquiring Hartwell Manufacturing, a 75-year-old family business in Ohio that employed 800 people and served as the economic anchor for the town of Millbrook. Richard had already decided that Hartwell's manufacturing operations would be relocated to Mexico within 6 months of the acquisition. The Ohio facility would be closed, the 800 employees would be terminated, and Hartwell's valuable brand name would be licensed to overseas manufacturers. The restructuring would increase the company's profit margins by 34% within 2 years. As Richard reviewed the acquisition documents, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex business strategy coming to fruition. He was about to add another $50 million to his personal wealth while unlocking shareholder value from an inefficient family business. But at 11:47 a.m., as Richard signed the final acquisition papers, he experienced what doctors would later determine was a massive hemorrhagic stroke. A blood vessel in his brain ruptured, causing immediate loss of consciousness and critical brain damage. Richard collapsed at his desk, still holding the pen he had used to sign the papers that would destroy 800 jobs and devastate an entire community. His assistant found him 20 minutes later and called 911. Richard was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital, where neurosurgeons worked for 6 hours to stop the bleeding in his brain and relieve the pressure on his brain tissue. Dr. Patricia Martinez, Richard's neurosurgeon, explained to his estranged wife Catherine that while the surgery had been successful, Richard remained in a critical condition. The stroke was severe, Dr. Martinez told Catherine. We've managed to control the bleeding, but Richard is in a deep coma. His brain needs time to heal, and we can't predict when or if he'll regain consciousness. If he does wake up, there may be significant changes in his cognitive function or personality. What Dr. Martinez couldn't predict was that Richard's consciousness, trapped in his damaged brain, was about to experience something far more transformative than any medical intervention could provide. On the 3rd day of his coma, Richard became aware of consciousness returning, but not in any way he had ever experienced before. Instead of waking up in a hospital bed, he found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast courtroom, with hundreds of seats filled with people he recognized but couldn't immediately place. The courtroom was unlike any legal setting Richard had ever seen. Instead of traditional court furniture, the room contained a massive mirror where the judge's bench should have been. The mirror reflected not Richard's current appearance, but showed him at various ages throughout his adult life, sometimes as the young, idealistic business student he had been, sometimes as the ruthless executive he had become. As Richard tried to understand where he was and why he was there, a figure approached him from the gallery of observers. Richard recognized him immediately. It was Thomas Hartwell, the 73-year-old owner of Hartwell Manufacturing, the family business Richard had just acquired before his stroke. But this version of Thomas Hartwell looked different from the defeated businessman Richard remembered from their final negotiation meeting. This Thomas radiated a quiet dignity and moral authority that commanded Richard's attention in ways the real Thomas never had. "Richard," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of profound disappointment, "do you understand why you're here?" Richard tried to respond with his usual corporate confidence, but found that his voice sounded uncertain and small in this strange environment. "I don't know what this is," Richard said. "Some kind of hallucination from the medical procedures, I assume." Thomas shook his head sadly. "This isn't a hallucination, Richard. This is accountability. For 25 years, you've made decisions that destroyed people's lives while telling yourself it was just business. Now you're going to experience the human cost of every choice you made." As Thomas spoke, Richard began to notice that the hundreds of people in the courtroom gallery weren't just random observers. They were people whose lives had been affected by his business decisions, employees he had fired, retirees whose pensions he had canceled, community members whose towns he had economically devastated. "We're all here," Thomas continued, "everyone whose life you changed through your strategic restructuring and efficiency improvements. And you're going to experience what your decisions meant to each of us." What followed was the most intense and horrifying experience of Richard's life. One by one, people from the courtroom gallery approached him to share their stories, not as abstract business casualties, but as complete human beings whose lives had been shattered by his corporate decisions. The first person to approach was Maria Santos, a 54-year-old woman Richard didn't immediately recognize. But as she began to speak, Richard remembered her. She had been a quality control supervisor at Midwest Electronics, one of the first companies he had acquired and restructured 23 years earlier. "Richard," Maria said, "I worked at Midwest Electronics for 18 years when you bought the company. I was 2 years away from qualifying for full pension benefits when you terminated my position to reduce operational redundancies." As Maria spoke, Richard found himself experiencing her story not as a detached observer, but as if he were living through her experience himself. He felt her shock when she learned about the layoffs, her desperation as she searched for new employment at age 54, and her growing fear as months passed without finding work that paid enough to support her family. "I lost my house," Maria continued, and Richard felt the shame and heartbreak of foreclosure proceedings. "My daughter had to drop out of college because I could no longer afford tuition. My marriage ended because the financial stress was too much." Richard experienced Maria's divorce, her depression, her eventual bankruptcy, and the years of struggle that followed. He felt what it was like to apply for dozens of jobs only to be told he was overqualified or not the right fit, corporate euphemisms for age discrimination that Richard had never bothered to consider when he made his layoff decisions. 23 years later, Maria concluded, "I'm still working part-time retail jobs to survive. I never recovered financially from what you did to me. But you saved the company $67,000 a year by eliminating my position." As Maria's story ended, Richard was overwhelmed by emotions he had never allowed himself to feel: genuine guilt, empathy for another person's suffering, and horror at understanding his role in creating that suffering. But Maria's story was only the beginning. Over what felt like days in this courtroom of conscience, Richard experienced story after story from people whose lives he had destroyed. Each encounter forced him to live through not just the immediate impact of his decisions, but the long-term consequences that rippled through families and communities for years. He experienced the story of James Patterson, a 47-year-old father of 3 who had worked at Sterling Automotive for 12 years before Richard closed the plant and moved production overseas. Richard felt James's desperation as he watched his unemployment benefits expire, experienced his humiliation as he worked multiple minimum wage jobs trying to support his family, and shared his anguish as his teenage son turned to drugs to cope with their family's financial stress. "My son died of an overdose 2 years after you closed our plant," James told Richard. "He couldn't handle watching our family fall apart. In your restructuring reports, I was listed as eliminated redundancy. But I wasn't redundant to my children. I was their father, and you took away my ability to provide for them." Richard experienced the story of Eleanor Rodriguez, a 67-year-old woman whose pension benefits he had canceled during his acquisition of Great Lakes Manufacturing. He felt her terror at facing retirement with no savings, her humiliation at needing to ask her adult children for financial help, and her despair at having to take a job as a grocery store cashier at age 70 to pay for her medications. "I worked for 42 years expecting to retire with dignity," Eleanor said. "You stole my pension to improve your profit margins by 0.3%. I'll be working until the day I die because of your greed." Each story built upon the previous ones, creating an accumulating weight of moral responsibility that Richard had never allowed himself to feel. He began to understand that his business metrics represented real families destroyed, real communities devastated, real people whose lives were permanently damaged by his pursuit of maximum profit. Perhaps most devastating were the stories from community members whose towns had been economically destroyed by Richard's plant closures and business relocations. Richard experienced the perspective of Dr. Sarah Chen, who had served as the only physician in Riverside, Pennsylvania, a town of 3,500 people that had depended on Sterling Chemical Works for economic stability. When Richard closed the plant and moved operations to Asia, he eliminated 600 jobs that supported nearly half the community's families. "Within 2 years of your plant closure," Dr. Chen told Richard, "our town lost its school, its library, and its hospital because the tax base collapsed. Young families moved away looking for work. Elderly residents had to travel 60 miles for basic medical care. You didn't just close a factory, Richard, you killed an entire community." Richard experienced the slow death of Riverside through Dr. Chen's eyes. He felt her frustration as she watched patients delay medical care because they could no longer afford treatment. He shared her heartbreak as she delivered babies knowing their families might have to leave town to find work. He experienced her final day in Riverside when she was forced to close her medical practice because too few patients could pay for services. "Riverside is a ghost town now," Dr. Chen concluded. "But in your annual reports, the plant closure was listed as a $12 million cost savings. You reduced 3 generations of community life to a line item on a spreadsheet." As these confrontations continued, Richard found himself trying to mount the same defenses he had used throughout his career, arguing that his decisions were necessary for business efficiency, that market forces required difficult choices, that he was simply doing what any rational executive would do. But in this courtroom of conscience, his usual justifications sounded hollow and pathetic. When he tried to explain that closing plants was necessary to remain competitive, Maria Santos replied, "Competitive with whom? Companies that exploit workers in countries with no labor protections? You chose to compete by making American workers disposable." When Richard argued that his decisions had benefited shareholders and investors, James Patterson responded, "Your investors made money while my son died from an overdose caused by poverty and hopelessness. Is their profit worth more than his life?" Richard began to realize that every rationalization he had developed for his behavior was simply a way to avoid confronting the moral implications of his choices. He had spent 25 years telling himself that business was separate from morality, that market forces justified any decision that increased profits, and that he bore no personal responsibility for the human consequences of his corporate strategies. But faced with the real people whose lives he had destroyed, Richard could no longer maintain these psychological defenses. As Richard absorbed story after story of the lives he had destroyed, the massive mirror at the front of the courtroom began to change. Instead of showing Richard at various ages, it began to display scenes from throughout his life, but scenes he had never noticed or had chosen to forget. The mirror showed Richard as a young man, full of idealism and genuine concern for other people. It showed him in college, volunteering at homeless shelters and tutoring disadvantaged children. It displayed his early career, when he had been known for treating employees fairly and building businesses that strengthened communities. "Do you remember who you used to be?" asked a voice from behind Richard. Richard turned to see a figure he recognized but hadn't thought about in decades, his college roommate and best friend, David Morrison, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. "David," Richard said, shocked to see his old friend in this strange courtroom setting. "I'm here representing the person you used to be," David replied. "The Richard Sterling I knew in college would be horrified by the man you became. He cared about people. He wanted to build businesses that helped communities thrive. He believed that success meant making life better for everyone, not just for yourself." The mirror continued to show scenes from Richard's transformation, the gradual compromises, the small moral concessions that had accumulated into complete moral blindness, the step-by-step process by which he had convinced himself that other people's welfare was not his responsibility. "When did you decide that money was more important than human dignity?" David asked. "When did you choose to become someone who could destroy 800 families and feel nothing but satisfaction about improving profit margins?" Richard watched his own moral deterioration play out in the mirror and realized that his transformation had been so gradual that he had never consciously decided to become a person who caused massive human suffering. It had happened one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, one decision to prioritize profit over people at a time. After experiencing dozens of stories from people whose lives he had destroyed, Richard thought his ordeal in this courtroom of conscience was finally over. But then Thomas Hartwell approached him one final time, and Richard realized that the most difficult confrontation was yet to come. "There's one more story you need to hear," Thomas said. "The story of what will happen to the 800 families at Hartwell Manufacturing now that you've acquired our company." Richard found himself experiencing a flash-forward vision of the consequences of his final business decision, the acquisition of Hartwell Manufacturing that he had completed just moments before his stroke. He saw the announcement that would come in 6 months. Hartwell Manufacturing would be relocated to Mexico, and all Ohio operations would cease. He experienced the shock and despair of 800 employees learning that they would lose their jobs. He felt the fear of workers in their 50s and 60s who knew they would never find comparable employment. Richard witnessed the slow economic death of Millbrook, Ohio, as the town's primary employer disappeared. He saw families forced to sell their homes at losses, teenagers leaving for cities with more economic opportunities, and elderly residents struggling to survive as local businesses closed due to reduced customer base. 800 more families destroyed, Thomas said. One more community devastated. And for what? So you could add another $50 million to a fortune you could never spend in 10 lifetimes? But then Thomas showed Richard something unexpected. A vision of what could still be prevented. "Your acquisition isn't final yet," Thomas explained. "Your stroke happened before all the regulatory approvals were completed. Your company's board of directors is meeting tomorrow to decide whether to proceed with the Hartwell acquisition or abandon it due to your medical condition." Richard realized that unlike all the other lives he had destroyed, the Hartwell Manufacturing situation could still be changed. The 800 jobs could still be saved, the community could still survive, and the families could still have hope for their future. "This is your choice, Richard," Thomas concluded. "You can influence what happens next, but only if you're willing to truly change, not just feel guilty about the past, but commit to preventing future harm." As Richard contemplated Thomas's words, he found himself faced with the most important decision of his life. He could return to consciousness as the same person he had been, wealthy, powerful, and indifferent to human suffering, or he could use his remaining time to try to repair some of the damage he had caused. What would it mean to truly change? Richard asked Thomas. "It means using your wealth and power to help instead of harm," Thomas replied. "It means seeing other people as human beings instead of business metrics. It means accepting responsibility for the consequences of your actions and dedicating yourself to creating positive change instead of maximizing profit." David Morrison stepped forward to join the conversation. "The Richard the First knew in college wouldn't hesitate," he said. "He would see this as an opportunity to become the person he always wanted to be, someone who used his abilities to make the world better for everyone." Richard looked around the courtroom at the hundreds of people whose lives he had destroyed. For the first time in decades, he saw them not as obstacles to profit maximization, but as human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and the chance to build good lives for themselves and their families. "If I choose to change," Richard asked, "can I somehow make up for what I've done to all of you?" Maria Santos, the first person who had shared her story with Richard, approached him one final time. "You can't undo the harm you've already caused," she said. "My house is still gone, my daughter still couldn't finish college, and my marriage still ended. But you can make sure you never cause that kind of harm again. And you can use your wealth and influence to help other people avoid the suffering you caused us." The question, Thomas Hartwell added, is whether you have the courage to give up the life you built on other people's pain and create a new life dedicated to healing instead of harming. Richard Sterling opened his eyes in his hospital bed on a Monday morning after 8 days in a coma. Dr. Martinez was amazed by his rapid neurological recovery, but she was even more surprised by the first words he spoke upon awakening. "I need to stop the Hartwell acquisition," Richard said with urgent clarity. "And I need to establish a fund to help the people I've hurt over the years." His wife, Catherine, who had been maintaining a bedside vigil despite their estranged relationship, was shocked by Richard's priorities upon awakening. "Richard, you nearly died. The doctors need to examine you and make sure you're okay." "I'm more okay than I've been in 25 years, Richard replied. "But I need to make some calls immediately. There are people whose lives depend on decisions that are being made right now." Richard's first action was to contact his company's board of directors and recommend against proceeding with the Hartwell manufacturing acquisition. "The business case doesn't make sense anymore," Richard told the board, using language they would understand. "The reputational risks outweigh the financial benefits, and we should focus our capital on more sustainable growth strategies." The board, confused by Richard's sudden change in strategic priorities, ultimately voted to abandon the acquisition. Hartwell Manufacturing remained an independent company, 800 jobs were saved, and the community of Millbrook continued to thrive. But Richard's transformation was just beginning. Over the following months, Richard implemented what business magazines would later call the most dramatic corporate transformation in modern business history. He established the Sterling Restoration Fund with an initial investment of $200 million of his personal wealth, dedicated to providing financial assistance to people whose lives had been damaged by his previous business decisions. Maria Santos, the quality control supervisor whose story had been the first Richard experienced in his coma vision, received a settlement that allowed her to pay off her debts, help her daughter complete college, and achieve financial stability for the first time since losing her job 23 years earlier. James Patterson, whose son had died from an overdose after Richard closed the automotive plant, received funding to establish a drug rehabilitation center in his community, transforming his personal tragedy into a resource for helping other families avoid similar devastation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the physician whose practice had been destroyed when Richard eliminated the economic foundation of Riverside, Pennsylvania, received support to establish a traveling medical clinic that provided healthcare services to economically devastated rural communities. Richard also fundamentally changed the operating philosophy of Sterling Industries. Instead of acquiring companies to strip their assets and eliminate jobs, Sterling Industries began investing in businesses to help them grow sustainably while maintaining employment and community connections. Richard Sterling has become unrecognizable from the corporate raider he used to be, wrote Forbes magazine in a profile published 2 years after his stroke. He's using the same strategic mind that once destroyed communities to figure out how to rebuild them. Dr. Martinez, Richard's neurosurgeon, was fascinated by the dramatic personality changes that had resulted from his stroke and coma experience. Richard's case represents one of the most complete personality transformations I've documented following a brain injury, Dr. Martinez explained to her colleagues. It's as if the stroke somehow gave him access to empathy and moral reasoning that had been suppressed for decades. Brain scans showed that Richard's stroke had affected regions associated with emotional processing and moral decision-making, potentially explaining his sudden ability to understand and care about the human consequences of his actions. Dr. Patricia Chin, a researcher studying the relationship between brain injuries and personality change, interviewed Richard extensively about his coma experience. Richard's vision of confronting the people he had hurt appears to have been a form of psychological processing that allowed him to finally acknowledge the human cost of his business practices, Dr. Chin concluded. Whether the experience was neurological, psychological, or something else entirely, the result was a complete transformation from someone who caused harm to someone dedicated to healing. 5 years after his stroke, Richard Sterling had become one of the nation's leading advocates for ethical business practices and corporate social responsibility. The Sterling Restoration Fund had grown to over $500 million and had provided assistance to more than 3,000 individuals and families affected by corporate restructuring and plant closures, not just from Richard's own companies, but from similar situations across the country. Richard had become a sought-after speaker at business schools, where he taught courses on sustainable capitalism and human-centered business strategy. I spent 25 years proving that you could make enormous amounts of money by treating people as disposable, Richard told one MBA class at Harvard Business School. But I learned that money earned through human suffering isn't wealth, it's theft. Real success means creating value for everyone affected by your business, not just extracting value from them. Richard's transformation had inspired other executives to reconsider their own business practices. The Sterling model of ethical corporate restructuring was being studied and implemented by companies around the world. Perhaps most importantly, Richard's transformation had allowed him to rebuild relationships that had been destroyed by his years of ruthless ambition. His wife, Catherine, who had been planning to file for divorce before his stroke, began to see glimpses of the man she had originally fallen in love with 30 years earlier. The Richard I married was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely cared about other people, Catherine reflected. I watched that man disappear over the years, replaced by someone I barely recognized. But after his stroke, it was like the person I had loved was finally able to come back. Richard's adult children, who had been estranged from him for years due to his obsession with business success at the expense of family relationships, slowly began to rebuild connections with their father. Dad was always too busy making money to spend time with us when we were kids, said Richard's daughter Sarah. But now he's interested in who we are as people, not just what we're accomplishing. It's like having a real father for the first time. Today, Richard Sterling continues to serve as CEO of Sterling Industries, but the company now operates according to principles that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was before his stroke. Sterling Industries has committed to never eliminating jobs purely for profit maximization, to maintaining operations in communities that depend on them, and to sharing prosperity with employees through profit sharing and ownership programs. Every business decision we make now passes what I call the Maria Santos test, Richard explains, referring to the first person whose story he experienced during his coma vision. If our decision would cause the kind of suffering that Maria experienced, we don't make that decision, regardless of the potential profit. The Sterling Restoration Fund has become a model for corporate responsibility, and similar programs have been established by other companies seeking to address the human costs of their business practices. Richard has never forgotten the courtroom vision that transformed his understanding of his life and choices. He keeps photographs of many of the people whose stories he experienced during his coma, and he regularly visits communities that have been affected by corporate restructuring to better understand the human impact of business decisions. Richard Sterling's stroke and coma experience forced him to confront something that most successful but morally compromised individuals never have to face: the complete human cost of their choices and the person they had become in pursuit of wealth and power. His vision of being confronted by every person whose life he had destroyed wasn't supernatural. It was his conscience finally breaking through decades of psychological defenses and forcing him to acknowledge the reality of his impact on the world. The courtroom wasn't a place I went during my coma, Richard reflects. It was the place I had been avoiding my entire adult life, the place where I would have to account for my actions and face the people I had hurt. My brain injury just made it impossible to keep avoiding that confrontation. Richard's transformation from corporate destroyer to healing advocate proves that it's never too late to change, never too late to acknowledge the harm we've caused, and never too late to dedicate our remaining time to creating positive change instead of continuing patterns of harm. The mirror of regrets showed Richard not just who he had become, but who he had once been and who he could still choose to be. In choosing to change, he discovered that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about using the lessons of that past to create a better future for everyone affected by our choices. Today, when business students study Richard Sterling's case, they learn not just about corporate strategy and profit maximization, but about the human cost of treating other people as obstacles to success rather than as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The mirror of regrets continues to reflect Richard's choices every day, but now it shows a man who uses his wealth and power to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, and to create hope rather than despair for the thousands of people whose lives intersect with his business decisions. In confronting every person he had destroyed, Richard Sterling discovered that the only person who could truly destroy him was himself, and that the only person who could redeem him was the same person who had caused all the harm, the man he chose to become after finally looking in the mirror and seeing clearly who he really was.